and since I can remember, this has probably been the most suffocated I've felt. And so I've been trying to process some of this, and I thought this would be a good time for me to just share some of my perspective, some of my opinion about what's going on racially and in terms of justice in America. And so for the first time, I'm talking on a unholy Trinity. You know, I'm a pastor, and so I'm accustomed to talking about the Trinity. But I think there's been this unholy Trinity that has surfaced in our country. I want to give you perspective on it. And so for me, you know, it starts with Amy Cooper. And you know, I don't know how any person of any race, particularly white people, though, I don't know how you can witness what Amy Cooper does as she calls, a brother literally is just bird watching. And I want you to understand what happened. She literally weaponizes race. This is a white person that knows that the system, the police system in America, the criminal justice system in America is so designed opposite of the support and help of people of color that if I just make a phone call, it does not matter if I tell the truth or not. I want you to think about the weaponization of race. I want you to think about systemically and institutionally what it represents. You know, it's a white woman that says, it does not matter if I'm wrong. All that matters is you're black and they're law enforcement. And because I'm wrong, but you're black and they're law enforcement, even if you wind up with nothing happening to you, by the time they figure it all out, there's still going to be some damage to you. So I think it's not fair of any person of any gender or color or creed or ethnicity to just look at the Amy Cooper situation and not clearly see that white Americans understand that there is a systemic institutional racism against people of color that they can use as a weapon whenever they want to. Now, this is the domino effect. I'm sharing this because I think this is how we got to the place of riots. And then you have the whole issue of Ahmaud Arbery, literally, I grew up with a perspective of knowing what it means to be black and driving. Now is at a point of black and jogging or black and running. And again, we see a scenario where a person of color does not even live with enough freedom, enough liberty, enough privilege to be able to enjoy the most basic of experiences that other people in humanity and in our country experience. So you have a man that is gunned down, and literally, were it not for the outcry of America, people that did it would be walking the streets right now. But because people, because of social media, and listen, the only difference between 2020 as I broadcast this and share my hearts on this critical conversation of race, the only difference between now and 2020 and 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, even 30 years ago is not how often it happens, but the fact that we have more tools in our arsenal to be able to expose what happens. Fast forward now to George Floyd, and to hear a grown man cry for their mother. I mean, if lynching is a mode of suffocation, if lynching is a mode of asphyxiation, whether it is a noose or whether it is a knee, it doesn't matter. It's a public lynching. And clearly, all three of these instances have proven that we have a major systemic racial issue in America. Think about it. If the very people that take the oath, I'm a public servant as well. I took an oath. Police officers take an oath to protect and to serve. If the very people that take the oath to protect and serve do not do that for people of color, people that are poor, what does it really communicate? Who do they go to be protected? Who do they go to be served? And now this unholy trinity of events, Amy Cooper, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, creates a domino effect. If you've ever set dominoes up and know that you set them up just the right way, the cascading effect they have, and when you hit one, they all start knocking down. And it's easy to say, oh, I wish, this shouldn't have happened or it didn't happen, but the dominoes have been set up and they've been hit, and now we have this ripple effect. And this past Sunday in my church, I didn't preach on this. I didn't preach on it because I did not want the emotion of this moment to rob me of my anointing to preach as a motivation. I want the motivation of what I preach to be based upon the Holy Spirit. And in as much as I know the Bible is relevant, I don't want the trigger, the reason I preach something to be something in the news. I want to deal with it as the text lets me deal with it, but I'm not going to just stop and say, oh, this person got killed, this situation happened, so I'm going to preach on it. I think the motivation of preaching should be the scriptures. The motivation of preaching should be the Holy Spirit. And so I didn't preach on this on Sunday, but I do have a response to it. And that's what this critical conversation today is about. It's about having a response to some of what's been going on. It gets complicated, right? Because the domino effect has got us to a point where now people begin protesting. And let me just say, rightfully so, people should be protesting. And then there are other groups of people that beginning to loot, right? That's painful to watch for a lot of reasons. And I don't want this to be heard as my being in support of or in agreement to people looting. But I'm struggling because I have a lot of white friends, a lot of white colleagues, people that are much more conservative than I am, even though I can be pretty conservative. I'm more moderate. And I've had people say, that does not help. Pastor, that doesn't help. Representative, that doesn't help. James, the looting doesn't help. And I hear that, and I don't support the looting. Here's the struggle. The struggle is for that person who's looting, their not looting didn't help. So the very people that are saying, well, when you loot, it doesn't help. Well, man, for how many years did I not loot? How many years did I share my pain? How many years did we ask for things to be fixed? And now all of a sudden, because I'm doing something, I'm basically destroying that which is not mine, right? I'm taking what is not mine. The very people, and this is just James Gailliard sharing his heart on his podcast. The very people oftentimes who are white and Republican and conservative who say, looting is wrong, are the very people that gerrymandered districts that in essence resulted in looting entire communities, stealing services, stripping communities of health care, stripping communities of Title I funding, stripping communities of proper representation, stripping communities of proper support service, stripping communities of having properly funded public education, stripping communities of having properly funded preschool programming and smart programming. What a hypocrisy. And I need you to hear me. I'm not saying that these men and women that are looting and destroying property, they are right. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that for the generations of people that have participated in their own looting, as my grandmama would say, that's the pot calling the kettle black. And at some point, we've got to be honest about our hypocrisy. The very fact that people can open up their mouth and say it is wrong, but cannot open up their mouth to say killing a black man is wrong or having systemic racism or systemic injustice is wrong. What a major hypocrisy. And it's a worse hypocrisy for me because it comes out of the mouth of people that claim to know Christ. And so we're in this kind of awkward kind of time because the looting is wrong. In no way at all can you equate the life of property and a life. One has nothing to do with the other. It breaks my heart to see the businesses being destroyed. But I think we gotta be careful about how we weigh in on this stuff. And as using the words of scripture to ask myself, is this possibly like I'm talking about the speck in your eye, and I have a big old tree on the side of my face, but I got the nerve to talk about the little speck or the little toothpick in your eye, but I got a big old log coming out of the side of my face. We need to be careful. This only exacerbates this type of conversation. Most of you know I'm biracial. I was born in 1965. The reason that's telling is because the anti-miscegenation laws in the United States did not pass until 1967. My parents, my mother, second generation Irish immigrant, and my dad, African American, who migrated from the Charleston, South Carolina community, got married in 1960. In 1960, it was still against the law for their marriage to be considered lawful in all 50 states. As a matter of fact, my parents could not have come to North Carolina, where I'm recording this from and where I pastor and where I'm a state representative. They could not have come to North Carolina for fear of the system forcing me into adoption, taking them from me, taking me from them, and literally them being thrown into jail. Because even though they were legally, lawfully married in one state, many states would have considered it unlawful and illegal. So they were married for 7 years before that changed. I was 2 years old before that changed. And so I grew up, my mother, who was, again, this white Irish woman, she's 87, still alive. She grew up sharing with me that you are a black man, that society will not see you as biracial. They will not see any white in you. You are black. And she raised me to see myself, and I'm glad she did, as a black man. 1978, I desegregated or helped desegregate my middle school. In the mid 70s in Philadelphia, they started adding schools for academically gifted kids, and those schools were placed in white communities. And those white communities were not segregated communities. And so I would take the bus and the elevated train, or a bus and a trolley, depending on the route. I would get into an area called Kensington, and literally people would start throwing bottles. They would start trying to knife us. They would call us the N-word. And we went through this. And the reason I'm sharing this is because there are groups of people who feel like, well, my dad did not enslave anybody. My granddad did not enslave anybody. But what they don't realize is you are the byproduct. If you grew up white in America, and even if you're my age, which is 55, you grew up in an era where you were provided rights and opportunities that I was not provided. And even though you may not have personally held slaves, you may not have personally lived during the Civil War, you may not have personally experienced any of that, the reality of it is your success is partly as a result of a system that set you up for success. You were not ducking bullets or knives or bottles when you were in 8th grade trying to get an education. So 1978, we desegregated and we were bussed into other communities. And then, as a black man, I'm trying to help you understand that racism is real and that it has implications to today. And that's what this critical conversation about race is about on Orthodox Today. I've never once sat in the home and had a meal of anyone that's on the white side of my family. Some of it was because they just disowned my mom because she married a black man. And some of it is because my grandmother, for example, my maternal grandmother, she lived in a community, as I just mentioned, called Kensington. Well, Kensington in the 70s and even into the 80s would firebomb people's homes if black people went to their homes. And even when my dad would take my mother to visit her mother, he would have to drop her off 5-6 blocks away and then let her walk the rest of the way so they would not see my grandmother's daughter with a black man for fear of my grandmother's home being firebombed. So because of that, I could never step foot in her home. And to this day, I'd never have stepped foot in anyone's home that was on the white side of my family. This is my family we're talking about, y'all. But race is such a god for people that they don't realize the implications even to today. This is critical conversations about race for people that think this isn't real. I pastor a church in Rocky Mount, and before we bought the Home Depot, we were located in South Rocky Mount. I was living in Wilson, North Carolina at the time, about 20 miles away. I've always worked late shifts at the church, working late hours to study and develop community programming. One particular night, this was like 2008, 2009, somewhere around there. I'm leaving the church. At that time, I had a black Audi A8, and our church was in the hood in South Rocky Mount. And I get about 2 blocks away from the church, headed to Wilson, and blue lights behind me. Blue lights behind me. I stop. I hit the window. The officer says, "May I see your registration and your license?" I asked, "Can I ask why you stopped me?" He said, "I'd like to see your registration license, please." I know as a black man, you don't fight that conversation. I hand him my license and registration. He goes back to the car. About 90 seconds later, he comes back. He hands them back to me and said, "I apologize, Pastor Gailliard. There was a mistake." And I said to him, "Well, what exactly was the mistake, officer?" He said, "Again, I apologize, Pastor. You have a good evening." The reality of it is I was in a black Audi A8, a very expensive car, in the hood at night. And just because I was driving nice and black, I get stopped. People who are white don't have those experiences. You don't have the experience of, let me shut up and be polite and respectful because I want to make sure I get home to my family and my children. And I think it's important in this era that we're in that we understand that people are rioting and protesting and people have had enough because these situations that we talk about are really real. I'm not done with the proof of it. This is my own life. 2014, our church bought a Home Depot. We occupied, as a matter of fact, I'm recording now in our podcast studio at the Impact Center in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. The 120,000 square foot facility we've turned into an impact center that reaches people literally all through our state and our region for that matter. What people don't know about this is that we had opposition from white members of our community to try to prohibit us from buying the building. They didn't care who bought it, as long as it wasn't a black church and a black organization. So we had some fights on our hands behind the scenes to be able to buy this building. The other thing that people don't know is that we got redlined by every bank in the city of Rocky Mount. Not one, not two, not three, every single bank. No one would fund our project. And we had $1 million sitting in the bank here in Rocky Mount. We had audited financials. We had a business plan where all of the economics of the purchase made sense. There was simply no reason other than the fact that we were a black organization. So the only way we got funded is, guess what we did? We went to a black-owned bank in Durham, North Carolina, Mechanics and Farmer, who looked at our plan, looked at our audit financials, and just said, there's just no business reason not to do this. We have to do this. That was 6 years ago. We have spent millions of dollars renovating the building. Our staffing model has worked. Our economic impact has worked. Everything that we said we were going to do worked. But this is what I want you to hear. The only reason not a single bank funded us is because we were an African-American church. So when people are protesting and people are rioting, it's because they know that these issues are real. I was just sharing with somebody, I have a lot of white friends, or at least I thought I did. I've not heard from a single white friend in the midst of this issue. In what is perhaps the most controversial, most painful moment in the life of African Americans in general and African American males in particular, I have not received a single phone call, single text message from general members of the community, with the exception, I will say this, of 2 white pastors in our community. And they know who they are, and I appreciate them very much. But I'm still not done with my experience. I've been pastoring for 20 years. You oftentimes hear people talk about that Sunday morning is the most segregated time in American life. that that's true, but it's incomplete. It's an incomplete statement. It's an incomplete statement because there are lots of black people that attend churches that are pastored by white people. The reason America is the most segregated time, Sunday is the most segregated time in American life, is not because of black people. It is because of white people. The truth of the matter is that given the scope of our ministry, the training of our staff, the influence we have in the community, the biblical nature of our ministry, given all of that, there's very little reason for us to have as few white members as we do. And I'm grateful for the ones we do. They are some special people. I tell a few of them, man, you remind me of my mama. She's just like, look, I'm just going where I'm being fed. I'm going to go do what's right. I want y'all to hear my heart. This is going to be very difficult for people. It is very difficult for white people in this day to submit themselves to African American leadership. Black people all day long will go to a church that's predominantly white and sit under a pastor who's predominantly white, and they will submit to that leadership. Racism and the systemic institutional nature of racism is so ingrained in our culture and in our community, in the very fabric and the very fiber of America, that many white people cannot fathom the thought of submitting to an African American in terms of leadership. And so to this day, we see example after example where white people are like, you know what, I can't do it. I'm a member of the Benvenue Country Club. You know, for many, many years, I was the only African American member. I don't know how many we have now. I can tell you that it is an unbelievably small number. I don't know that we've ever even had an African American sit on the board of the country club. You know, in 2020, we should not be looking at such a small minority of people to be a part of that kind of social environment. But again, more and more examples of the systemic institutional nature of racism. So when you see people protesting, you see people rioting, it's for a reason. What else I want to say is kind of in my heart about this? You know, this is it's going to be kind of hard, but I blame a whole lot of this to the white conservative evangelical church. I blame, I think the Southern Baptist Convention, because the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest, conservative evangelical convention. You got a whole lot of blame in this. Your hands are not clean of this blood. I've watched not just the SBC, but I've watched other evangelical groups manipulate the issue of race to their benefit. I want you to pay attention to what they have done. I just had a conversation with a Southern Baptist president of a seminary, challenging him on the lack of minority staff, the lack of African American staff, particularly the lack of African American students. His rebuttal to me was the percentage of, this is the quote, ethnic minorities that we have. And I was highly offended by that analysis, because this is part of the manipulation of the evangelical church. Because we don't have African Americans, we'll substitute that with ethnic minorities. So that's every other person of color in the universe. Asian people, Filipino people, Somalian people, you name it. And so because we don't have a regard for attracting and retaining African American students, we'll hide under the guise that we're doing the work and call it ethnic minority. It's highly manipulative to do that, and disingenuous, and not honoring to Christ. I've watched evangelical churches do this, where they worship not Christ, but they worship color. They worship commerce. I mean, say what you want about our current president, there is not a God-honoring explanation for supporting our current president. And don't give me the right to life argument, okay? Do not do that. Because if right to life mattered, then the life of immigrants would matter. If right to life mattered, the life of African Americans would matter. If right to life mattered, you'd be able to open up your mouth and say Black Lives Matter. Just because a person says Black Lives Matter does not mean blue lives don't matter. It just means Black Lives Matter. I can open up my mouth and say white lives matter, Asian lives matter. I can open my life and say the lives of gays matter, the lives of lesbians matter. I could wear a sign that says that. Every human being, Imago Dei, that is made in the image of God, their life matters. How disingenuous, dishonoring to Christ is it that you can't say Black Lives Matter? And the further manipulation of the evangelical church is hiring staff people. And this is going to be very controversial, but this is my critical conversational race, no one else's. The manipulation of hiring a black staff person to be a youth pastor, to be your executive pastor, to be the assistant to the president, to be a faculty member. In most situations, those African American people that are hired are married to white or Asian women. Now, I'm not suggesting they're not good people. I'm not suggesting that brother isn't still a brother. I am suggesting that the evangelical community has been unwilling to fully embrace the culture of African American people. If you want to fully embrace the culture of African American people, hire you a youth pastor with a sister who wraps her head. Hire you a youth pastor with a sister that's got to have a child sit between her legs so she can braid her hair. Hire you a youth pastor, executive pastor, staff person whose wife's hair is not wash and go, or whose hair might be in locks or in dreads. But you don't want to fully embrace the culture of the African American community. And instead, you want to say, but we hire ethnic minorities. It was not ethnic minorities being suffocated and lynched in front of us. It was not ethnic minorities that somebody was calling the police on in the middle of a park. It was not ethnic minorities that the justice system is stacked against. So don't equate it, and then don't treat us like we don't have a brain and we don't know the difference between African Americans and ethnic minorities. So I think that the evangelical church is a big problem right now, and I think you have to be a part of the solution. And let me say this. You know, I told you white people already don't come to black churches. But for those black people that are going to white churches, this is what I will say to you. If that church does not embrace a theology of social justice, if they don't embrace a theology where the gospel is both about justification by faith and social justice, where it is about revelation and relevance, where it is about God addressing and ministering to the whole person, I would highly encourage you to leave that ministry. People of color, black people, we don't have the luxury of giving our tithes and offerings to people that are oppressing us and suffocating and lynching our community. If you're funding that, then you're part of the problem. And so we've got to really evaluate that. This is my truth on what's going on racially. I'm not going to be like the people rioting. I'm going to leave you with some things I think we should do different. Some things that I think can happen. First of all, I said this in my pulpit and I believe it. You should not be out there protesting or rioting if you don't vote in every election. I mean, the single biggest way to fix this is to vote. And I think sometimes we feel like the answer is protesting or politics. The answer is both protesting and politics. And so you shouldn't even be out there unless you're voting. And I'm not talking about just voting for the president every 4 years. I'm talking about voting the down ballot in every election. Some of the most powerful people in our community are our district attorneys. Those district attorneys decide who gets charged and who doesn't get charged. That's a matter of an election. And some of you are upset. Let me say this. Some of you are upset because of the third-degree murder charge of the police officer. Let's become critical thinkers of issues. As critical thinkers of issues, think about what was communicated. The reason third-degree murder charge and not a first degree is because the district attorney is not confident that they can get a guilty sentence on first-degree murder. It is a statement by the district attorney that we don't even trust the criminal justice system as it relates to black lives, even when the lynching occurred in the public view. So they're making their own statement about how flawed the criminal justice system is. You got to vote in every darn election. I'm talking about the primaries, the elections where there's no big balloted stuff like U.S. Senate seats and president and governor. You got to vote that down ballot, and you got to make sure you are voting the best interest of your community. I pastor in the city of Rocky Mount. I know of 8,000 people just in the Nash side of the city of Rocky Mount that did not vote in 2018. That's got to change. 2016, I'm sorry, in 2016. I think, number one, you have to vote or you shouldn't be protesting. And I would argue that if we were voting, we may not have some of these issues. Number two, you got to complete the census. It's a way that money is being stripped away from our communities when we don't properly stand up and become counted. I think the third thing that I would offer is to become educated on the issues. I get the emotionalism, but at some point I've got to take a step back and I've got to become a critical thinker of the issues. Here in North Carolina, and I know people from all over the country will be listening to this. Here in North Carolina, as we are all over the country, we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. And as a result of that, we've had stay-at-home orders or shelter-in orders like pretty much the whole country has had. And we had some people boycotting, protesting. I want you to get this. At the governor's mansion, in front of the General Assembly, these were people that were carrying rocket launchers, machine guns. First of all, you shouldn't be protesting with weapons. But even though they broke the law did not hold them accountable. But I want you to become really critically educated. I have a lot of members in my church that are hairdressers, barbers. I don't know of one. I literally don't know of one barber, one hairdresser, one cosmetologist, one person that does eyebrows. Literally, I don't know of one in my congregation. I don't know of one in my community that was down there protesting that they couldn't go back and cut hair yet. Now, I want you to think about it. The people that were down, this is becoming educated people about our issues. The people that were down there were not hairdressers. The people that were down there were protesting. Let me tell you the difference. They were protesting so other people could serve them. It was not hairdressers protesting so I could go back to work. They weren't even protesting so hairdressers could go back to work. They were protesting because we want our hair cut. We're protesting because we want somebody to serve us. Meanwhile, you have another group of people that's protesting because we want people to no longer be killed in the street. And when you look at the response of law enforcement, it was totally different for each group of people. That's fundamentally not just, and it needs to change. We need to vote. We need to take the census. We need to become educated on the issues. We need work groups at every level. State, local, in cities and municipalities and counties, local, state, and federal work groups on all of the major issues. A work group on health, a work group on education, a work group on commerce, which would include workforce, a work group on law enforcement, a work group on housing and transportation and food and nutrition. We need comprehensive work groups in all of our communities so that we can begin substantively rolling out policy recommendations that are going to benefit all of America and not just certain groups in America. We need to regulate police departments, and we need to look at policing models and make sure that our policing models are not perpetuating generations of racism. So we need to look at how we penalize police departments that cover for rogue cops. how we create a culture within law enforcement. And I have good friends in law enforcement. My son is in basic law enforcement training right now. He's in the police academy right now. But there is something fundamentally wrong with the system. We need to penalize, we need to regulate that. I'm an advocate personally of a citizens police review board or a citizens police review committee. I think we need further investigation in that. I think we need to look at the validity in that. A big part of our problem, and maybe the biggest part of our problem, is economics. We need to have a whole system available to provide low interest loans to black owned businesses, to African American owned businesses. We need to help those businesses get established. We need to make it easier for records to get expunged so that people can get jobs when they get released. I think we need to look at decriminalizing every drug abuse. If I'm in jail over drug abuse or drug use, we need to decriminalize that. How we still have people serving time as a result of some conviction around crack cocaine and not somebody who's involved in opioids. A drug abuse is a drug abuse. We need to decriminalize all of it, and we need to do it immediately. Foundations and endowments, they're able to basically their revenue as it grows is exempt from taxation by the IRS, and in exchange for them giving that money to nonprofits, the work of schools, the work of communities. Talking about foundations and endowments. But many times they're only perpetuating some of the injustice that we know, because that money oftentimes is not going into African American communities. It is not going to nonprofits that are run by African Americans or that largely serve African Americans. If the IRS is going to give a tax advantage so that you give your money out, 5% of it every year, I think there also needs to be a requirement for the diversification of the board. So the people that sit on the boards, the people that sit on the endowments, the people that sit on the trusts have a diversity of thought around them that can help them give money to communities that are desperately in need of it. I think we need to revisit the Community Reinvestment Act. And, school banks have hidden behind the CRA, where they're supposed to utilize their funding to be a specific benefit to the community. And they have found a way to fund private interests, to fund privately held companies, to have pet projects that for the most part benefit the majority population and not people of color. I think we need to revisit the Community Reinvestment Act as another example. And I'm sure there are many more. Listen, all I've tried to do today is share my reality on this issue of what's going on. I'd love for you to give me your feedback. And I'd love to hear your ideas about an agenda, a set of ideas as we move forward. I really believe that this is a defining moment. This is a turning point moment in the life of our community and the life of our country. And I pray that we would all have critical conversations about race, and that people that don't look like me would listen to our stories, listen to our experiences, and be willing to be a part of the solution and not to further perpetuate the ugly years of racism in America.